evening, colleagues, friends, family. My name is Ingrid Willard. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences, and it's my enormous pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. A very special welcome to our Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Professor Klutter, Vice-Rector for Research, Innovation and Postgraduate Studies, who's here representing the Rectorate. Welcome, Professor Klutter. So this is an inaugural lecture, is a really auspicious occasion. It's a milestone in a professor's academic career, and it's always a fantastic evening of celebration and also knowledge sharing. So I have a very small role to play. I simply have to introduce Professor Biggs to you, and she'll then speak to us for about 30 minutes or so. So Professor Biggs was born in Windhoek in Namibia, and from the age of 11 she had the exceptional privilege of living in Skukuza in the Kruger National Park. She completed her undergraduate degree in Geography and Environmental Sciences through UNISA, again an unusual aspect of her career. She did her honours degree at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, her master's degree at WITS, and clearly somebody who liked to move around. She then moved to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she did her PhD. After her PhD, she was clearly again restless, and she went on to join the Stockholm Resilience Centre, where she continues to be affiliated. Professor Biggs currently holds the DST NRF South African Research Chair in Social Ecological Systems and Resilience, and she's an NRF P-rated scientist. So the way the NRF system works is that for young researchers below the age of 40 that are within 5 years of their PhD, they can obtain either a Y1, Y2, or a P rating. And P ratings are incredibly rare, and the NRF only awards a P rating if they truly believe that the researcher is destined for really, really great things. And so we certainly think that the NRF made the right decision in making Oonsie P-rated, and we look forward to watching her career as it develops. Professor Biggs is currently based at the Centre for Complex Systems and Transition, and it's still affiliated, as I mentioned earlier, with the Stockholm Resilience Centre in Sweden. She co-chairs the Science Committee of the International Programme on Ecosystem Change in Society. She leads the Southern African Programme on Ecosystem Change in Society and serves on the South African Global Change Science Committee. She was recently a coordinating lead author for the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystems Services Assessment. She serves on the editorial board of several journals. Remarkably, Oonsie has already graduated 6 PhD students and 9 master's students, so an incredibly productive young researcher. So it's my enormous pleasure to hand over to Professor Biggs, who is going to talk to us this evening. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ingrid, for that very warm welcome. And also thanks so much for everyone here for coming to share and listen a bit about my research, but also share this event with me tonight, especially after working hours in the rain. I really appreciate that. So I thought I'd start with just giving a very short personal background. And Ingrid found these things out herself without me telling you, but I've added a few pictures to that. So as was mentioned, I was born in Windhoek when it was still Southwest Africa, and I actually spent a lot of my childhood outdoors. In fact, I could hardly find a photo of me not being outdoors. And I think one of the things about my childhood was also that I had the chance to actually be involved in some research-like activities already from quite an early age. Both my parents were vets, and on the weekend their hobby was to track birds of prey, and especially the pale chanting goshawk, which we spent many a weekend following. And this photo at the bottom is actually me climbing up in the trees when I got a bit older, and then looking in the nests and looking how many chicks there were and weighing them, etc. And then when I was 11, we moved to the Kruger National Park, where obviously I also continued to spend a lot of time outdoors, and also being exposed to a whole lot of other kinds of research activities, since Skukuza is actually a major international research site now in the world. So I think I had a lot of good experiences there. I also got the hang of the whole school thing, and started winning a lot of prizes. Then for my university studies, as was mentioned, I actually ended up deciding to study through UNISA, also because of all the opportunities that were offered in Skukuza as a research site. So I actually became involved in several papers when I was still doing my undergrad. And it was also an interesting experience, sort of taking charge of your own studies and your own time entirely. I then moved on to university campus, but not for very long. And I did my honours in Pietermaritzburg, and then my master's at Wits. But most of that time I was actually based at the CSR in Pretoria, working with Bob Scholes, who I'd actually met in Skukuza. And I became involved in this Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which was a major initiative in the early 2000s, involving, I guess, some of the top scientists, ecologists, economists, social scientists, to assess the state of the world's ecosystems. And I think as a young person, having the opportunity to be involved in that and being treated as one of the experts was really an amazing experience. And I think many of the young people that were involved felt that the thing that they did after that was quite a come down from that excitement. I think another highlight during my master's was that actually one of my master's papers we got published in Nature. So that was also quite a big highlight. Then I moved on to the University of Wisconsin, and I'd actually met Professor Steve Carpenter also through the Millennium Assessment. He was chairing the scenarios aspect. And this is also when I started shifting more of my attention to focus on issues around ecosystem management rather than kind of studying biodiversity or land cover change itself. And I think that was also reflecting that it's apparent that many of the issues we're dealing with actually lie in that domain in terms of making a difference. I also got exposed to many very novel, extremely cold weather activities like ice fishing. And another important link there is that I became part of the Resilience Alliance Young Scholars, which is one of the leading network in this social ecological research space. And I ended up also being one of the coordinator for that network, which is something that I've built on in the future as well. So from Wisconsin, as Ingrid mentioned, then I went on to the Stockholm Resilience Center, and these were also actually links and networks that I built during the course of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And this was also an incredibly exciting space to come into. It was just newly established when I arrived in Stockholm. It was a kind of a leading new center based on some of the research coming out of the Millennium Assessment, and really trying to integrate the social and the natural sciences and focusing on kind of informing governance of these systems for better sustainability. And then just briefly, sort of my route back to South Africa. So I was always keen to come back here, but it wasn't quite clear how I should do that. But initially I actually came back here as a Stias Young Fellow, and this was also facilitated by Paul Sillier and Jannie Hofmeyer, and I was the first Young Fellow in 2012. And then I became a research associate at the Center for Studies in Complexity, together sadly Paul had just passed away then, but together with Jannie and Rika, who are sitting here. And then in 2015, I was awarded the Saatchi Chair, and then also that was the same year that the CST was established. So we moved into that new space. And then just sort of a last personal thing is that the last few years have been very busy. I also got married, and now I have a 2-year-old that keeps me awake at night. So that's a little bit of personal background. And then I thought it would be useful just to say a little bit about how I see the kind of broad context and motivation for my research. And I think several people have heard this before. But I think for me, the broad context is really this idea that we live in the Anthropocene, which is this new geological era in which human activity has really become a dominant force, shaping the way the planet functions at this global scale. And there's been different debates about when the Anthropocene started, but I think there's now a broad agreement that it's sort of starting around 1950, and that's due to signatures in the geological record that will be there for thousands and millions of years into the future, from nuclear fallout, new kinds of rocks called plastic glomerate, And then also interestingly, the Anthropocene chicken, because chickens have actually become incredibly much larger during the last 50 years. And this will also be laid down in the geological record. And the reason this is important is because it raises this question of whether we're eroding the underlying planetary conditions or environmental conditions that potentially underpin kind of modern complex societies. And I think this is quite a nice graph that maybe gives some hint of this, but that the Earth's temperature and I think a whole range of other variables were much more variable in the past. But it's only in this most recent geological era called the Holocene when we actually see settled agriculture and the development of these big complex societies. And in that era, the Earth being a complex system has kind of stabilized in a much lower variability state. And this may be quite important in terms of our ability to actually grow food, maintain our infrastructure and cities, and the kinds of populations that we have today. We do have new technologies, so we may be able to also cope with a more variable climate, but it is likely to be very disruptive. The other issue that is clear in terms of context is that the Anthropocene is not just something that's hit us, but that it itself is rooted in our modern systems of production and consumption. And so several authors have also argued that, in a sense, we should think of this more as the Capitalocene. And these conditions around the way that we're living on the planet and organizing our societies are not just creating environmental problems, but also a large host of social problems. One of which is this issue around what you could term obscene inequalities in terms of the distribution of wealth and resources and consumption on the planet. Another big issue is that in many ways we've become increasingly connected and connected very distant places around the world, ecologically, economically, and socially. And some of these connections then also mean that that we kind of have surprising events that start in one place suddenly having ramifications in other parts of the world. But also that this kind of speed at which we're having new technology and its ability to spread is often much faster than we can actually develop institutional responses to deal with that. And then just to underscore that many of these changes in a host of socioeconomic and Earth system trends are particularly evident since the 1950s, and this period has now been termed the Great Acceleration. And where exactly it's going, we're unsure of. And for me, the way I like to think about this is that it really frames a challenge that we are facing at the Earth system scale, in the sense that these changes to the Earth and to society haven't all been bad, and at least at a material level, we have very many more people on the planet, and for many people, their material well-being has been dramatically improved. And this is largely through access to what we think of as ecosystem services or benefits that people get from nature, such as fresh water, food, timber. But there's a lot of evidence that this trajectory that we're on is unsustainable, and that many of these environmental conditions, both including resources, but things like regulation of the climate, are degrading or insufficient for the future. And then also this really important issue around rising inequalities that is also very evident here in South Africa. And so just in terms of ending off, in terms of the context, I think it's become very apparent that the Earth and human society have become deeply intertwined, and there've always been some of these interconnections at local scales, but this is now at the global scale. And if we're thinking about improving human well-being and the human condition, we cannot think about how to do that without recognizing the interconnections between people and nature at these interconnected local to global scales. And that's really the challenge that we face in terms of thinking, in a sense, of different ways of generating wealth and prosperity. So within this broad context, I thought I'd just give some brief highlights of my work. And I've also built my Saatchi chair around three key areas. The first one is more theoretical and conceptual around what is social ecological resilience. And then the second one is around tipping points. And then the third one, which is, I think, increasingly where my work is moving, around sustainability transformations. I also have a fourth important component of my work and my chair, which is around building these regional networks of research around social ecological systems. And I think this is quite a challenging space to work in, because it is trying to bridge across the social and natural sciences, and that's a very deep and long-standing divide. And this is particularly through my associations, or my role in SAPEX and the Program on Ecosystem Change and Society globally. And I'm not going to talk much about that, but we have, I just put this together. Since 2012, when we started SAPEX, we've actually run a huge number of events, and I think have made quite a bit of impact in the region in terms of providing a home and a space for dialogue and learning around this emerging area of research. So then, just to go briefly through just some highlights in terms of the work that I'm doing. So maybe just firstly to say something around how we think about resilience, also because this has become a very popular term that is now all over the place, but it's also a term I think that there's been a lot of conceptual advances and development over time. But the way that I really think about resilience is as one kind of emerging concept that is really focusing on dealing with the challenges of the Anthropocene, specifically through building capacity to deal with change. So it's less focused on predicting the change, but actually having capacity to deal with the unexpected that comes your way. And that's particularly relevant in terms of the novel conditions of the Anthropocene. And it's rooted in a complexity-based approach, at least in terms of the work that I'm doing. And then just briefly, resilience, and I think people also understand this in different ways, but it actually has three dimensions to it in terms of the work that we do. The first is it's this capacity to persist or recover in the face of change. So this is an example of very heavy pollution on the beach, and to what extent processes can be maintained. But it's also about the capacity to adapt to change. And I think one of the big ones we see in Africa is this very rapid urbanization, and what is the capacity of our systems to actually adapt to these changes that are happening. And then thirdly, and this is increasingly where a lot of work is moving, is a capacity to innovate and transform. And so this is about fundamentally actually changing the structure and dynamics of the systems we're living in for creating better outcomes. And we see a very clear also progression in terms of the way people are thinking about resilience over time. And so one of the things I've been also quite involved in is also thinking around these definitions of resilience, and you need that in order to actually operationalize some of the research. But as you can see here, these three dimensions of resilience are now really reflected in the most recent definitions in terms of having this capacity to buffer shocks, adapt, and transform in response to change. The other thing that I think has been a big change is that it's become quite a normative definition. So this is about the capacity to sustain human well-being, which also brings it into a different kind of space. And then this was actually growing out of my association with the Resilience Alliance, and it was a big network of young scholars. We put together this book, so it's kind of a critical assessment of principles or factors that help build resilience in social ecological systems. And we've actually got a few flyers outside here, but that was, I think, a very big and kind of a landmark initiative also in my career so far. Where a lot of my work is heading now is around actually thinking around operationalizing resilience. And I think several of the projects that we're involved in now are really kind of taking this approach and thinking about how do we operationalize resilience through kind of inclusive participatory dialogue processes that really think about what are we trying to build resilience to, what kinds of disturbances do we have in mind, and then I think very importantly also for who's benefiting and losing in terms of the kinds of resilience that we're building. And so not just assuming that what's there or what we have currently is a good thing. And then the issue of time frame is also really critical. Then just lastly on this kind of area of work, we're also doing quite a bit of work on sort of trying to understand the dynamics of social ecological systems. And the important thing is that we don't think of them just as social plus ecological systems. And I think this is quite an important distinction. But we're really trying to look at these interconnections and feedbacks and how the one affects the other and then feeds back again. And I think the most exciting initiative, or another major project that we're engaged in here, and this I'm doing together with several colleagues at the CST, is putting together this textbook or handbook on methods for studying social ecological systems, and it includes a very wide diversity of methods from the social sciences, from the natural sciences, also from economics. And then I also wanted to mention one other very interesting, exciting study that is underway that I'm quite excited about, is also trying to actually take a science and technologies way of looking at this emergence of this new research area. And Amanda Magnani has just started on that journey at the CST this year. Then the second area of work is around regime shifts, and this is also building actually on my PhD and my postdoc. And just briefly, the way we're thinking about these regime shifts are as these large persistent changes in system structure and function associated with crossing a tipping point in a system. So it's kind of a complete reorganization of the system and the way it works. And at least in the environmental sphere, but also in other spheres, there are actually a lot of examples of this. And even, for instance, the coral reef example is very well known, and that has very big impacts also on people that are dependent on those reef systems for their livelihoods. So why they matter is because they often come as a surprise. They're very difficult to predict, and once they occur, they can be very difficult or even impossible to reverse. They generally have very big impacts on ecosystems and on society, and because of the very big pressures we face in the Anthropocene, many of these tipping points are increasing in frequency. So this initiative I've been involved in for probably 10 years now is building up a big database of different examples of these regime shifts and the impacts that they have on human societies. And so it's kind of regime shifts that matter in terms of managing ecosystems. And this is a really exciting analysis, I think, that is currently under review. Round 2 is that we've tried to put together looking at where different regime shifts could occur in the world based on the types of ecosystems and pressures you have there, which of the SDGs could be undermined by those potential regime shifts. And generally, the possibility of these kinds of ecological changes have not been accounted for at all in terms of considering the SDGs. So it's really trying to think about helping highlight policy interventions and priorities in different world regions. And then this is really where I have a lot of students also engaged in doing kind of detailed empirical work at different levels, from the postdocs to students all around the country, and also some big synthetic work. So many of them are also here in the room. So then, just to move to my last area of research, and I hope I'm still kind of in time, is really around sustainability transformations, which I think is really the big issue that we're facing, and very exciting area of work, also challenging. In one sense, what I like, this figure from Will Stephan, sort of illustrating how we might think about it, is that sort of in this kind of regime shift metaphor, we've moved outside of the Holocene kind of basin of attraction or regime, and currently we're speeding to somewhere. But if we stay on the current trajectory of change, we're very likely to end up in a much warmer world that could be very, very challenging for society to cope with. So the real question we're facing is, how do we sort of turn off that trajectory that we're on? And I think it's very clear that we're not going back to the Holocene. We're trying to just stabilize in some new condition, but that is maybe more stable environmentally in terms of the societies and the I think also the infrastructure that we've built up. So this is really, I think, a nice way of thinking about this challenge. So one area of work that I was involved in the second round, the update is around this idea of a safe operating space for humanity, or the planetary boundaries. And I think this was quite an ambitious attempt to try to set out, if we have to think about this good Anthropocene, what are the basic Earth system conditions that we need to maintain in order to have Holocene-like conditions that probably pose fewer risks than going very far from that. And this was a big initiative. It also provoked a lot of discussion, but I think it's the kind of ambitious work we need to be doing. This has more recently been complemented by, I think, very importantly thinking about the social dimension also, and the updated version of what's called the donut is really focusing on the SDGs. So what are also the basic sort of human conditions, social conditions that we want to achieve? And I think this starts giving us a sense of what is it that we're aiming at. But I think what we don't have yet is what kind of system structures and processes are going to produce that outcome. That I think we really have no good sense of. So one project that I've been involved in, I think is one of the most exciting projects the past few years, is the Seeds of the Good Anthropocenes project. And this is also quite an ambitious out there project, but the goal was really to try to explore and start developing a narrative about not just what one good Anthropocene, but also think about different kinds of options that might be out there. And we're particularly interested in capturing perspectives from kind of non-dominant groups and cultures, so that we're not just stuck in the current ways of thinking. And this project had two kind of big arms to it. The one is a global initiative, so it was one of the initial fast-track initiatives that was funded under Future Earth. And then we also got a bunch of funding here in Southern Africa to actually do more detailed work. So essentially the underlying premise for this work is that meeting this Anthropocene challenge that we face requires a really big shift. It's not just about tweaking the ways that we're living on the planet. It's potentially a fundamental change. At least that's what I also believe. And just as a kind of a metaphor, it's sort of something on the order of the kind of change we had in the whole way society was organized and the ways we were producing materials from the medieval to the industrial times. And we need something huge like that in order to meet the challenges we're facing. And this also entails a really deep shift probably in the way we understand the world and our relationship to the environment, but also to each other. So then why focus on seeds? And this really came out of kind of complexity theory thinking, is that what we know, and also from Future's work, is that we're very constrained in our ability to imagine really different futures. And so, for instance, a medieval person would probably never be able to imagine the kind of world we're in today. So we probably can't imagine what this world looks like. But what we do know is that radical change often starts or emerges from things that are actually present. It's like pockets of the future in the present. But we cannot predict what they might grow into, just like a seedling. But there's a very diverse kind of initiatives out there that we could maybe look at for inspiration. So this project really tries to survey these innovations and experiments that different people might feel can contribute to a good Anthropocene, and then we try to put them together in a kind of very new process to develop new kinds of scenarios. So, and I think this has been a super hopeful project. It's really nice when you actually change your lenses and start looking for what is potentially working and then what could be transformative. You actually find there are lots of interesting examples out there, and they also spark lots of debate about whether they really could be good or not so good, and for whom, and I think it's really interesting issues. As I said, we've been collecting these through an online campaign, and also in Southern Africa, which I think really added a lot of value, is that we ran a series of these dialogues engaging local stakeholders in particular contexts to look for seeds of positive futures in the places they're working. And then, as I mentioned, and I think this is something very cool to be proud of, also together with my colleagues Tanya and Rika here, is that we developed this new process, sort of a bottom-up scenario generation process for putting these different seeds together to imagine the future. And what we get from that are some very science fiction-y futures. But the interesting thing is the people engaged in those processes, and we had artists, but also policymakers and municipal officials, and most people already thought, wow, these futures are really possible, and they're already happening. Which, when you just read the scenarios, you would feel like, wow, these are really strange things. But I think because we're building them from elements of things that are already present, and then just thinking about how those could grow, they actually seem more plausible. And then this process has then been used in other arms of this project around the world, but also it's very been taken up especially through the work of my colleague Laura Pereira in the IPBES global process, and they're using that now for the IPBES scenario process. And then just lastly to mention, and I think this for me is also where some of the work with this going forward lies, is that Tanya introduced us to this 3 horizons framework for thinking about change. And what you kind of see currently is that you have a lot of things in the world and powerful forces that are structuring the way the world is now. But into the future, we need those things to decline. And then we've got these positive seeds or elements of the future, but they're very marginal and squeezed out currently. But we're wanting to grow those. And so really thinking about those dynamics of transition, and I think especially the battles, the potential battles and spaces for capture, and kind of policies that one could think about for supporting positive change in this second horizon space, I think is somewhere where we'd like to do some of our next work. So with that, I thought I'd just finish with this little whiteboard video that we made from this project that I think kind of summarizes a lot of the research quite nicely.
We live in turbulent times and are surrounded by visions of dark and uncertain futures. Societies are changing, and people are transforming the environment, the entire planet in unexpected ways. In many places, we are increasingly disconnected from nature and from each other. These are key symptoms of a new geological era, which scientists call the Anthropocene. But there is hope. There are seeds of positive futures all around us, seeds of good Anthropocenes. These seeds are projects, organizations, initiatives that are experimenting with doing things differently and making an impact for the better. Better for people and better for our planet. But for now, these seeds are small, local, and not part of the mainstream. What would happen if these seeds were to grow? If they became towering trees with interlocking networks of roots supporting and nourishing each other? What if these seeds became the way we do things, the way the world works? What would the future look like? This is what we asked a group of scientists, artists, and change makers at a workshop in Cape Town in November 2016. Starting with 4 sets of very different seed projects and initiatives, we asked the participants to imagine what Southern Africa would be like if these seeds were to grow, combine, and become the new normal. We asked them to stretch their imaginations. We asked them to dig deep. As a result, the participants developed 4 radically alternative positive visions for the future. Although these visions differed in their details, they had many striking commonalities. All 4 futures are deeply shaped by technology. This technology is used in a way that enables people to connect to each other, to develop a shared understanding and empathy, rather than become isolated and distrustful. Technological advances also free people up from working just to pay bills. Instead, people work to contribute to their community, live fulfilling lives, and express themselves as human beings. In all 4 futures, power is highly decentralized, and people actively participate in decision-making. Societies are more equal and fair, and value the unique differences between people. Collaboration, rather than competition, is a core ethic. These values extend to humanity's relationship with the environment. Thoughtless exploitation of resources is replaced by responsible stewardship of nature, which is understood to belong to everyone. Most food and other goods are produced locally, minimizing transport and waste. Overconsumption is replaced by flourishing societies in which people respect ecological limits and each other. Idealistic? Yes. Impossibly utopian? No. These are our visions, and the seeds of these futures already exist. Let us nourish them. We aspire to plant more seeds and let it grow into a beautiful new world.
So on that positive note, I'd like to just thank everyone for coming to celebrate tonight with me, and maybe just to leave you with this thought that I think is really something that's come up in this project, and that we're also thinking about, especially together with the philosophers, is around this question of whether the Anthropocene actually implies a new role and responsibility for what it means to be human. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oonsie, for this exciting inaugural lecture. I am doing this on behalf of Mark Swilling. We send his apologies because he couldn't make it. He's feeling unwell. And what I want to tell you, Oonsie, is that there are two types of academics. There are those who follow what the theory dictates, and there are those who follow things that life dictates. Thank you for being the latter.
Thank you.
I also want to thank you for your passion, dedication to the research that you're doing, and particularly for using the kinds of concepts that many people find it challenging to do, and particularly the fact that these concepts relate to the Agenda 2030 of Sustainable Development, and many of the things that all of us are tackling with relating to complexity, transdisciplinarity, and also sustainability. I would actually say that you are an inspiration to many young academics here, and thank you for that. I also want to thank you for the contribution that you're making to CST, as well as SPL at large, and also for the faculty and the university at large. And seeing what you've done from your young age to what you're doing right now, it's really, really an inspirational journey. And I would like to welcome you to this full professorial journey.